George Pullman was one of the most powerful industrial figures of 19th century America, even though his name never became as famous as the men who owned railroads or steel mills. He did not control tracks, locomotives, or shipping routes. Yet for decades, he controlled how millions of Americans experienced travel across the country. If you slept on a train, ate on a train, or crossed long distances without collapsing from exhaustion, there was a strong chance George Pullman's decisions shaped that experience. To understand why Pullman mattered, it helps to understand how brutal rail travel originally was. In the mid-1800s, trains connected cities but offered little comfort. Long journeys meant sitting upright for hours or days, trying to rest in hard seats while surrounded by noise, smoke, dust, and crowds. Overnight travel was especially punishing. People arrived sore, exhausted, and disoriented. For a country expanding rapidly across vast distances, this limitation mattered more than people realized. It influenced who traveled, how often they moved, and how business, politics, and culture connected across regions. George Pullman did not come from railroads. His early success came from construction and logistics. In Chicago, during periods of intense urban redevelopment, Pullman made money lifting entire buildings and relocating them intact to new locations. This was not glamorous work, but it required precision, planning, and absolute control over systems. A building could not be moved if one part failed. Every element had to function together. That experience shaped how Pullman thought about scale. Growth was not about ambition alone. It was about control, predictability, and repeatable processes. When Pullman turned his attention to rail travel, he approached it differently from railroad owners. He did not try to improve engines or tracks. He focused on the human experience inside the car. He designed sleeping cars with real beds instead of benches, enclosed spaces instead of open seating, cleaner interiors, and consistent layouts. These cars were not handcrafted luxuries. They were standardized industrial products designed to be reproduced, serviced, and deployed nationwide. Pullman's most important decision was not technical, it was structural. Instead of selling these cars to railroads, he leased them. The cars remained Pullman's property. Pullman hired the staff, Pullman set the service standards. Pullman handled cleaning, maintenance, and scheduling. Railroads simply attached Pullman cars to their trains. This allowed Pullman to scale rapidly without owning tracks, locomotives, or routes. Every new rail line became an opportunity to expand without duplicating infrastructure. This arrangement suited railroads perfectly. They avoided the cost and complexity of running premium services while still offering passengers a superior experience. For Pullman, it created a unique position. He controlled the part of rail travel passengers remembered most. Trains moved people from place to place, but Pullman shaped how that movement felt. Comfort became his product, and comfort quickly became an expectation. As rail networks expanded across the United States, Pullman cars moved with them. Business travelers preferred Pullman service because they could arrive rested and functional. Politicians used Pullman cars because schedules were reliable. Journalists, performers, and executives adopted them as the default option. Once passengers experienced uniform overnight comfort, they began expecting it everywhere. Railroads that did not offer Pullman service appeared outdated even if their routes were identical. Pullman's influence grew quietly through habit rather than advertising. Travelers booked tickets assuming Pullman cars would be available. Railroads structured premium offerings around them. Comfort stopped being an upgrade and became part of the journey itself. Pullman cars circulated continuously, moving between routes, cities, and maintenance facilities, according to tightly coordinated schedules. Maintaining this system required discipline beyond manufacturing. Pullman was not only producing rail cars, he was running a nationwide service operation that depended on people behaving consistently in confined spaces. Service quality depended on staff appearance, conduct, timing, and interaction with passengers. Any inconsistency was immediately visible. Unlike railroads, which dealt primarily with machinery, Pullman dealt with people face to face. This made labor control central to the business long before most companies recognized its importance. Pullman employees were trained according to strict standards, uniforms were mandatory, conduct rules were detailed. Schedules were tightly managed, workers represented the brand directly, and Pullman believed the brand could not tolerate deviation. Reliability was not optional. It was the foundation of trust. As demand increased, Pullman expanded production facilities, maintenance yards, and staffing networks. The company grew rapidly, combining manufacturing, logistics, and service into a single integrated operation. By the late 19th century, Pullman cars were present on major rail routes across the country. They were no longer a novelty. They were infrastructure. This success created a subtle form of dependence. Railroads relied on Pullman to satisfy passengers. Passengers relied on Pullman for comfort, without questioning who provided it. Pullman relied on maintaining absolute consistency to protect his reputation. Any disruption threatened not just revenue, but trust. That pressure pushed Pullman toward tighter systems and stronger control. The more the company scaled, the more complex the operation became. Cars had to be cleaned, repaired, rotated, and staffed efficiently across thousands of miles. Schedules had to align with railroad timetables. Staff had to behave uniformly regardless of location. This required centralized planning and predictable labor behavior at a level few companies attempted at the time. Pullman understood that managing this complexity required more than workplace rules. He believed that consistency could not stop at the factory gate or the train platform. Workers who lived unpredictably, he believed, would work unpredictably. Stability outside work became, in his mind, essential to stability on the job. This belief would soon push Pullman beyond rail cars and into social engineering. To protect the system that made his company powerful, Pullman began looking for ways to extend control beyond working hours. The solution he chose would make his company famous, controversial, and eventually a national crisis. By the time Pullman reached the height of his success, he had built more than a transportation service. He had created a model where comfort, discipline, and predictability reinforced each other at national scale. That model worked exceptionally well under growth, but it depended on control remaining intact everywhere at once. The next phase of Pullman's story begins when that control moved off the train and into everyday life, transforming workers from employees into residents and turning a business decision into a social experiment that America had never seen before. Pullman's rise also coincided with a deeper shift in how Americans understood time and distance. Before widespread rail travel, journeys were irregular and slow. Movement followed natural limits. With the expansion of rail networks, schedules became precise. Time itself became something that could be measured, sold, and optimized. Pullman's cars fit perfectly into this transformation. They allowed passengers to move long distances without losing productivity, turning travel from lost time into usable time. This quietly increased how far business, politics, and administration could operate from their centers. Because of this, Pullman cars became especially important to people who exercised power. Government officials traveling between cities relied on predictable overnight journeys. Corporate executives planned trips assuming they would arrive rested. Even military planners used rail travel systems shaped by Pullman standards. The company's influence extended far beyond leisure or luxury. It supported the practical functioning of a country becoming administratively and economically centralized. This influence strengthened Pullman's negotiating position with railroads. Once Pullman's service became associated with legitimacy and professionalism, rail companies hesitated to operate without it. Removing Pullman cars risked reputational damage, not just customer dissatisfaction. This dynamic allowed Pullman to dictate terms quietly, reinforcing his control without public confrontation. Railroads accepted the arrangement because it solved a problem they did not want to manage themselves. As operations expanded, Pullman invested heavily in facilities dedicated to building, repairing, and servicing rail cars. These were not small workshops. They were large, centralized complexes designed to keep cars in circulation with minimal downtime. Efficiency depended on workers showing up on time, following procedures exactly, and maintaining uniform standards regardless of fatigue or personal circumstance. The system worked because deviations were rare and tightly corrected. Pullman's view of management reflected a belief that order could be engineered. He did not trust informal systems or individual discretion at scale. Rules, procedures, and oversight replaced improvisation. This mindset produced consistency, but it also reduced tolerance for variation. The company's success reinforced the belief that tighter control produced better outcomes. By the late 19th century, Pullman had created a business that combined manufacturing, service, and logistics into one continuous national operation. It touched nearly every major city without being rooted in any one of them. The company's strength came from this reach, but also from the assumptions it created. Travelers assumed Pullman cars would be there. Railroads assumed Pullman would handle comfort. Pullman assumed control could be extended further without resistance. That assumption would soon be tested. As the workforce expanded and operational demands increased, Pullman began confronting problems that discipline inside the workplace alone could not resolve. Absenteeism, turnover, and labor unrest threatened consistency. For a system built on uniformity, even small disruptions mattered. Pullman's response was not to loosen standards, but to seek deeper stability. If workers' lives outside work could be made orderly and predictable, he believed their performance inside the company would follow. This idea did not emerge suddenly. It developed logically from years of managing a system where control equaled reliability. What began as a transportation innovation was evolving into something broader. Pullman was no longer just providing comfort on trains. He was preparing to design an environment where workers lived under the same principles that governed his railcars. That decision would move his company into uncharted territory, transforming a business strategy into a social experiment whose consequences would reach far beyond rail travel. Pullman's solution to workforce instability did not begin as an emotional or moral project. It began as an operational one. By the late 19th century, the scale of Pullman's business had outgrown informal labor management. Absenteeism, turnover, and disputes disrupted schedules in ways that directly affected service consistency. For a company whose reputation depended on uniform behavior across thousands of miles, unpredictability was not a minor inconvenience. It was a systemic risk. Pullman believed the source of that risk existed outside the workplace. Workers lived in crowded, unsanitary neighborhoods. Housing was inconsistent. Daily routines were shaped by environments Pullman could not control. In his view, disorder outside work translated into unreliability on the job. If discipline and consistency were essential inside the system, he reasoned they had to exist everywhere else as well. The response was radical but logical within Pullman's worldview. Instead of adapting the company to workers, Pullman decided to adapt workers' lives to the company. Near Chicago, he began constructing an entirely new town, designed, owned, and operated by the Pullman Company. This was not an informal settlement or temporary housing project. It was a fully planned community built from the ground up with industrial efficiency in mind. The town of Pullman was designed to look orderly, modern, and respectable. Streets were laid out cleanly. Homes were constructed to uniform standards. Public buildings, schools, churches, and parks were integrated into the plan. From the outside, it appeared progressive, even benevolent. Visitors described it as clean, calm, and well-managed, especially compared to the industrial slums common in other manufacturing cities. But every element of the town was owned by the company. Houses were rented to workers, not sold. Rent was deducted directly from wages. Utilities, water, and maintenance were controlled centrally. Local businesses were restricted. Independent ownership was discouraged. The company set prices, enforced rules, and monitored behavior. Alcohol sales were prohibited. Political gatherings were limited. Newspapers critical of management were unwelcome. Even small deviations from expected behavior could attract scrutiny. The town functioned smoothly because friction was minimized by design, not because residents had freedom. Pullman argued that this system benefited everyone. Workers lived in clean housing, crime was low. Public spaces were maintained. From an operational perspective, the results were clear. Attendance improved, output stabilized, service quality remained consistent. The town appeared to solve the problem Pullman had identified. What the system removed, however, was choice. Workers could not negotiate rent independently. They could not seek alternative housing without leaving employment. They could not influence local governance. The same entity that paid wages also controlled shelter, utilities, and daily life. This concentration of control mattered because wages did not exist in isolation. A worker's income determined survival, not just comfort. When rent, utilities, and employment were linked to a single authority, economic pressure intensified. Stability depended entirely on the company's continued favor. At first, this dependency did not feel threatening. As long as wages were steady and work was available, the town functioned. Many workers appreciated the cleanliness and order, especially compared to the conditions they had left behind. The absence of visible conflict reinforced the perception that the system worked. But the town was not designed to absorb shocks. Its structure assumed steady income and uninterrupted employment. There were no mechanisms for negotiation or adjustment if conditions changed. The same efficiency that made the system stable during growth made it rigid under stress. The town of Pullman operated less like a community and more like an extension of the factory floor. Rules that governed production extended naturally into housing and public life. Surveillance replaced participation. Order replaced representation. What looked like harmony was enforced alignment. As long as Pullman's business continued expanding, these tensions remained contained. The company town functioned because the broader system supported it, but that balance depended on economic conditions. Pullman did not fully control. When external pressures began affecting wages, the company town did not adapt. Instead, it amplified those pressures by removing alternatives. What had once felt orderly began to feel constraining. The same systems that delivered stability now delivered leverage. This was the environment in which Pullman workers entered the 1890s. Their lives were structured for predictability, not resilience. When the broader economy shifted, the consequences would not remain confined to factory output. They would spill into homes, streets, and daily survival, setting the stage for confrontation on a scale Pullman had never intended. Beyond housing, the Pullman Company controlled the economic circulation inside the town. There were no independent grocery stores, no privately owned taverns, no locally elected councils that could influence pricing or services. Commercial spaces were leased selectively, and only businesses aligned with company standards were allowed to operate. This meant everyday necessities were purchased in an environment where competition did not exist. Prices were stable, but they were not negotiable. Workers could not offset rent or living costs by seeking cheaper alternatives nearby. Governance followed the same structure. The town had no municipal government in the traditional sense. Decisions about sanitation, policing, maintenance, and public behavior were made by company-appointed managers. Rules were enforced through tenancy agreements rather than civic law. A worker who violated standards risked not only disciplinary action at work, but eviction at home. Employment and residency were administratively linked, even if they were not legally described that way. Public spaces reinforced this hierarchy. Parks, libraries, and gathering areas existed, but their use was regulated. Meetings that challenged company authority were discouraged or blocked. Political organizing was viewed as disruptive to order. Religious institutions were permitted, but sermons critical of industrial authority drew attention. The town projected calm because dissent had few places to settle. Pullman defended this structure publicly as progressive management. Visitors, journalists, and reformers were invited to tour the town. Many praised its cleanliness, low crime, and absence of visible poverty. Compared to the overcrowded industrial districts of Chicago, Pullman appeared modern and humane. These impressions mattered. They shaped how the broader public understood the company's role and muted early criticism. Internally, however, the system depended on a fragile assumption that wages would remain sufficient to support fixed living costs. Rent was calculated not as a flexible market price, but as a steady revenue stream for the company. It did not adjust automatically when earnings changed. This separation between income volatility and fixed expenses was manageable during stable growth, but it created latent pressure. Workers had limited mechanisms to express dissatisfaction. There were no local elections to influence policy. Complaints moved upward through company channels that ultimately answered to the same authority setting the rules. Leaving the town meant leaving employment. Staying meant accepting conditions as they were. This narrowed the range of responses available to individuals facing hardship. Pullman system also reshaped family dynamics. Because housing was tied to employment, entire households were affected by workplace decisions. A reduction in hours or pay impacted not just the worker but dependents, whose shelter and utilities were at risk. This intensified the consequences of management decisions beyond the factory floor. From an operational standpoint, the town succeeded in producing predictability. Attendance improved. Turnover declined. The workforce became easier to schedule and supervise. Pullman interpreted these outcomes as validation. The absence of visible unrest reinforced the belief that control produced stability. What the system lacked was elasticity. There were no buffers for economic downturns, no independent institutions to absorb stress, and no shared mechanisms for negotiation. Order replaced participation. Efficiency replaced representation. These choices were not accidental. They reflected Pullman's belief that complex systems function best when variability is minimized. As national economic conditions tightened in the early 1890s, these design choices became more consequential. Market shifts beyond Pullman's control began affecting revenues. The company responded as an industrial enterprise would, by adjusting wages. But the town had not been built to accommodate adjustment. Its costs remained fixed. Its rules remained unchanged. This mismatch transformed the town from a stabilizing environment into a pressure chamber. Economic strain that might have been diffused elsewhere became concentrated. Workers could not relocate easily. They could not renegotiate rent. They could not influence governance. The same structure that had delivered order now magnified imbalance. By the time wages were reduced, the town of Pullman had already narrowed workers' options to a single path. Compliance sustained the system. Resistance threatened survival. The company town had succeeded too well at eliminating alternatives, and in doing so, it set conditions where conflict would not dissipate quietly. It would surface collectively. These pressures did not erupt immediately. They accumulated. Conversations shifted. Trust eroded. The environment that once felt managed began to feel imposed. When the next change arrived, it would not be absorbed as routine adjustment. It would be interpreted as a breach, pushing the system past the limits of what control alone could contain. The economic downturn of the early 1890s did not arrive suddenly, but when it reached Pullman, its effects were immediate. Demand for rail travel softened, orders slowed, revenues tightened. For the Pullman Company, this was a business problem to be managed like any other. Costs had to be reduced to preserve stability. Management chose the most direct lever available: wages. Pay was cut across large portions of the workforce. In some cases, reductions reached 25 to 30%. These cuts were not framed as temporary adjustments. They were applied unevenly, department by department, with little transparency. For Pullman's managers, the decision aligned with standard industrial practice. When revenue falls, labor costs adjust. The company town, however, was not designed to absorb this logic. Rent in Pullman did not fall. Utility charges did not change. Prices inside company-controlled stores remained fixed. The mechanisms that governed life in the town treated wages and costs as separate systems, even though workers experienced them as inseparable. A smaller paycheck now had to cover the same obligations as before. This was not a budgeting inconvenience. For many households, it made basic survival uncertain. Workers began calculating the gap between income and expenses and found there was no room to compensate. They could not move to cheaper housing without leaving employment. They could not negotiate rent individually. They could not seek alternative employers nearby without abandoning their homes. The town's design had removed those options years earlier. Initial responses were cautious. Workers petitioned management, requesting rent reductions proportional to wage cuts. These were not radical demands. They reflected a basic expectation that income and living costs would remain aligned. Management refused. Pullman believed lowering rent would undermine the town's financial structure and set a precedent that weakened authority. From his perspective, the company town was functioning as intended. From the workers' perspective, it had become a trap. Discontent spread through conversation rather than organization at first. Families compared payslips. Neighbors shared calculations. The realization that hardship was widespread, not individual, changed how people interpreted their situation. What had felt like personal struggle began to look systemic. As frustration grew, workers turned toward collective action. The Pullman Company's workforce included skilled and semi-skilled laborers whose work was essential to rail operations nationwide. Many were already connected to broader labor networks through shared trades and transportation corridors. The American Railway Union, led by Eugene V. Debs, became a focal point for coordination. The conflict escalated when Pullman refused arbitration. Management declined to negotiate through external mediators, maintaining that wage decisions were an internal matter. This refusal hardened positions. Workers stopped work. Production halted. Pullman cars remained idle. The strike did not stay local. Rail workers across the country refused to handle trains carrying Pullman cars. This transformed a company dispute into a national transportation crisis. Rail traffic slowed. Freight shipments stalled. Passenger schedules collapsed. Cities dependent on rail deliveries began feeling shortages. Railroad companies responded aggressively. They argued that the boycott interfered with interstate commerce and mail delivery. Pressure mounted on federal authorities to intervene. What had begun as a dispute over wages and rent now implicated national infrastructure. The federal government entered the conflict by deploying troops to break the strike. This decision reframed the situation entirely. Workers were no longer confronting company management alone. They were confronting state power. Clashes followed. Property was damaged. Lives were lost. The strike became a public spectacle. Eugene Debs was arrested. The American Railway Union was weakened. Rail service resumed under military protection. The Pullman strike was effectively broken, not through negotiation, but through force. The immediate outcome favored rail companies and Pullman's management. Trains moved again. Production restarted. Wages remained reduced. Rent stayed fixed. But the broader consequences were already unfolding. Public opinion shifted. Investigations examined the structure of the company town and the conditions imposed on workers. What had once been presented as progressive management began to be questioned as excessive control. The same features that visitors had praised now appeared coercive. The strike revealed a central flaw in Pullman's system. It had eliminated flexibility in pursuit of order. When economic conditions changed, the system could not adjust without inflicting concentrated harm. Stability depended on uninterrupted growth. When growth stopped, pressure had nowhere to go except outward. The conflict also changed how labor disputes were understood nationally. The Pullman strike demonstrated how deeply integrated industrial systems have become. A dispute in one town could halt transportation across the country. Labor, infrastructure, and governance were no longer separable. Although the strike was defeated, it did not restore trust. Workers returned under surveillance and suspicion. Management resumed control, but authority was weakened. The company town remained intact physically, but its legitimacy had fractured. The economic crisis passed gradually, but the assumptions that had supported Pullman's model did not recover. The company had proven it could maintain order through force, but it had also exposed the cost of doing so. Control had preserved operations at the expense of stability. The Pullman strike did not end the company, but it ended the illusion that the system was sustainable. The conflict left behind unresolved questions about power, responsibility, and the limits of industrial control that would soon move beyond the town itself and into the courts, shaping the final chapter of Pullman's story. Beyond the immediate shutdown of rail traffic, the strike exposed how deeply Pullman's business model had become embedded in national logistics. Pullman cars were not an optional luxury at this point. They were integrated into passenger schedules, mail routes, and long-distance freight coordination. When rail workers refused to move Pullman-equipped trains, the disruption rippled through systems that had been designed around uninterrupted flow. Mail deliveries slowed. Perishable goods were delayed. Industrial supply chains that depended on rail transport began missing deadlines. Railroad executives framed the strike not as a labor dispute, but as a threat to national order. Their public arguments emphasized commerce, continuity, and federal responsibility. By positioning the strike as interference with interstate trade and postal service, they shifted the conflict from labor relations into constitutional territory. This reframing was strategic. It created legal justification for intervention that bypassed negotiation entirely. Federal authorities accepted this framing. Injunctions Injunctions were issued against union leaders, limiting their ability to organize or communicate. When resistance continued, troops were deployed to enforce rail operations. The presence of soldiers guarding trains marked a decisive escalation. Industrial conflict was no longer contained within factories or towns. It had become a matter of state power. Violence did not erupt everywhere, but it did not need to. The symbolism was enough. Workers understood that continued resistance would be met with force. Rail companies resumed operations under protection. The strike fractured as fear, exhaustion, and legal pressure took effect. What had begun as collective leverage dissolved into isolated defiance. Eugene V. Debs' arrest removed a central organizing figure and sent a broader signal. Leadership could be neutralized through the courts. Coordination could be criminalized. The American Railway Union emerged weakened, its capacity to act nationally severely reduced. The imbalance between corporate coordination and labor organization became unmistakable. Within Pullman, management interpreted the outcome narrowly. Production resumed, cars returned to service. The town remained intact. On paper, authority had been restored, but internally, conditions had changed. Surveillance increased. Trust diminished. Workers returned under closer supervision, aware that the system would not bend under pressure. The strike also reshaped public perception in ways Pullman could not fully control. Investigative reports and hearings examined the company-town model with new skepticism. What had once been praised as enlightened management was now scrutinized as excessive control. Testimony highlighted how rent deductions, lack of representation, and rigid rules amplified hardship during downturns. This scrutiny mattered because Pullman's power had relied in part on moral legitimacy. The company had presented itself as orderly, rational, and progressive. The strike disrupted that narrative. It exposed how efficiency could coexist with coercion, and how stability could be maintained at disproportionate human cost. Economically, the conflict left lasting damage. The company incurred losses from halted production and legal battles. Railroads absorbed costs from interrupted service. Cities experienced short-term shortages and delays. While operations resumed, confidence in the system had been shaken. The strike also influenced how future labor disputes were approached. Employers became more cautious about concentrating control too tightly. Policymakers began considering mechanisms to mediate industrial conflict before it reached national paralysis. The idea that private systems could generate public crises gained traction. For Pullman workers, the immediate outcome offered little relief. Wages remained lower, rent policies did not change, the town's structure stayed intact. What changed was awareness. The limits of negotiation had been revealed. The power imbalance was now explicit. The Pullman strike ended as an event, but it continued as a reference point. It demonstrated that industrial systems designed for efficiency could become brittle under stress. When pressure was applied, they did not flex. They broke outward. This realization extended beyond Pullman itself. It affected how corporations, unions, and governments understood interconnected infrastructure. A single company's labor policy had nearly halted national transportation. The implications were impossible to ignore. Although order was restored, the underlying questions remained unresolved. Who bore responsibility when private efficiency produced public disruption? How much control a company could exercise over workers' lives before it crossed into governance, and whether stability achieved through force could ever be sustainable. These questions would not be answered on the shop floor or in the town streets. They would move into courtrooms and legislative chambers, where Pullman's system would face judgment not as a business success, but as a social structure. The outcome of that judgment would determine whether the company town could survive its own logic. The confrontation that began on the factory floor and spilled onto the rail network did not end with trains moving again. The Pullman strike forced questions that could not be contained by restoring operations. The issue was not simply labor relations. It was whether Pullman's system blurred the line between employer and government. This distinction mattered because civic power carried responsibilities that Pullman had never accepted. There were no elected officials in the town, no mechanisms for representation, no independent institutions to mediate conflict. In 1898, the Illinois Supreme Court ruled that the Pullman Company could not continue owning and operating the town as it had. the court ordered the company to divest its residential properties. This decision struck at the core of Pullman's strategy. The company town was not a peripheral experiment. It was the mechanism that linked labor stability to service reliability. Removing it meant dismantling the structure that had enforced consistency beyond the workplace. George Pullman did not live to see the full consequences of this judgment. He died in 1897, before the ruling was fully implemented. By the time of his death, his reputation had already shifted. Once praised as an innovator and reformer, he was increasingly remembered as a figure associated with industrial overreach. His burial was reportedly encased in reinforced concrete, a detail often repeated as symbolism of the hostility he inspired at the end of his life. Following the court's decision, the Pullman Company began selling off housing and transferring municipal functions. Residents gained the ability to own property and participate in local governance. The town was eventually absorbed into Chicago. What had once been a closed system became subject to the same forces and variability as other urban neighborhoods. Order gave way to negotiation. Stability became contingent rather than enforced. For the company itself, the loss of the town altered labor relations permanently. Pullman continued operating railcar manufacturing and service operations, but without the ability to control workers' lives outside work. Management had to adapt. Labor discipline could no longer rely on housing leverage. Negotiation, arbitration, and external regulation became unavoidable. The Pullman Strike also reshaped national labor policy. It highlighted the dangers of allowing private systems to grow so interconnected that local disputes could trigger national crises. Policymakers began considering frameworks for mediation and intervention that addressed conflict earlier, before infrastructure was threatened. The strike influenced debates that would later inform labor laws and federal involvement in industrial relations. Unions drew lessons as well. The failure of the strike exposed vulnerabilities in organizing across industries with different legal protections. It demonstrated the power of injunctions and the risks of confronting state authority directly. Labor movements adjusted strategies, emphasizing political engagement alongside industrial action. Corporations, meanwhile, absorbed a different lesson. Pullman's model showed that total control could produce short-term efficiency but long-term fragility. Systems that eliminated flexibility also eliminated resilience. When conditions changed, they could not adapt without provoking conflict. This realization influenced how companies approached housing, benefits, and employee welfare in the decades that followed. The Pullman Company itself did not disappear immediately. It continued producing rail cars and operating sleeper services into the 20th century. Over time, however, its dominance faded as rail travel declined and alternative forms of transportation emerged. The company eventually became part of larger industrial conglomerates. Its identity diluted as its original model lost relevance. What endured was not the company, but the example. Pullman became a reference point in discussions about corporate power, labor rights, and the limits of private governance. It demonstrated how efficiency-driven systems could cross into social control when left unchecked.